platform, so I can't actually see and talk to all of you. In order for you to talk to us, you'll need to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. We will start in just a moment. My name is Ingrid Stearns. I am the On the Land Program Manager with Sonoma Land Trust. We are hosting a series of webinars called Language of the Land. And tonight we're featuring Arthur Dawson speaking about the early struggles for civil rights in Sonoma Valley. So just a few technical things. We are on a Zoom webinar platform, which means that you can see the presenters, but we cannot see or hear you. So in order to communicate, go ahead and type into the question and answer box. We'll be collecting questions for the very end. So Arthur will be giving a presentation for an hour, and then we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end. So we'll be collecting questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll answer as many of them as we can when we get to the end. So for those of you who are supporters of Sonoma Land Trust, thank you very much. We're happy to see you and have your support for the land conservation work that we do. For those of you who are new to Sonoma Land Trust, we are a nonprofit organization founded in 1976. We have helped protect over 50,000 acres of land in Sonoma County through the past 40 plus years. One of our properties that we own is called Glen Oaks Ranch. It's in Glen Ellen in the Sonoma Valley, and it has quite a long history. And so tonight, Arthur Dawson will be speaking about some of the context of the beginning of the ranch and what was happening during that time. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Arthur before I hand it over to him. So Arthur Dawson is a writer and historical ecologist who enjoys exploring and celebrating the landscapes of Sonoma County, sharing a sense of place through art and science. As a historical ecologist, he has collected oral histories from local elders and contributed field and archival research to local and regional restoration efforts. Currently an independent consultant, Arthur has worked with the Sonoma Ecology Center, Sonoma Land Trust, Sonoma County Ag and Open Space, Pepperwood Preserve, UC Berkeley, and many other agencies, organizations, and individuals. Arthur has authored 3 local bestsellers: The Stories Behind Sonoma Valley Place Names, On Foot in Sonoma with Rebecca Lawton, and most recently, in partnership with others, Where the World Begins, Sonoma Mountain Stories and Images, published by Sonoma Mountain Preservation. His column on Sonoma County place names appears monthly in the Press Democrat. He's been a guest lecturer at UC Davis, Sonoma State, and other colleges and universities. Arthur lives with his wife Jill in Glen Ellen. After raising 2 children there and rebuilding their home after the 2017 fires, they recently became empty nesters. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Arthur.
Okay, there we go. I'm videoed and unmuted right now. All right, well, thank you, Ingrid, and it's good to be here, and really heartening to see such interest in this presentation. And I know we have people who are joining us from at least as far away as Montana, so that's kind of cool. Let me share my screen, and I will start giving you the presentation. Whoops, there we go. So Charles Stuart and early struggles for civil rights in California. And I wanted to go beyond Charles Stuart in this. So this, it talks about him, but it's more about his role in early civil rights and just early civil rights in California in general. And let's see, I gotta figure out how to get this to go down. Sorry, just figuring out how to get the slide to advance here. Oh, there we go. So how did I come here to be giving this particular presentation? Well, there's a lot that has been going on recently in this country, and a month or so ago, I heard Demetrius Smith, who is the former chairperson of the Sonoma County Human Rights Commission, speaking, and she talked about how she came to Sonoma Valley, that she had been living in San Francisco and wanted to be somewhere more out in the country. And so she and her partner drove up probably 101 and then came over Bennett Valley Road over into Glen Ellen, and just talked about how much she fell in love with the place. And I know exactly what she's talking about because I live in Glen Ellen and I drive that road often. But then the thing that surprised me was she said that once she moved up here, and she's part Black and part Cherokee, that once she got here, she experienced so much racism in Glen Ellen that she ended up moving into the Springs, which has a much more diverse population. And that was a hard thing to hear. I've been here for 30 years, and it made me realize that this isn't as welcoming a town for everybody as I might think it is. And it made me realize that I've got some blindness. I mean, I'm a white guy. The benefits that I have from white privilege are in many ways invisible to me, and so in a sense I'm kind of blind to what she experienced. And so that was kind of a wake up, just to hear her say that. And this was shortly after the George Floyd was murdered, and so it was just making me think about these things. And so somebody asked her, because most of the audience was very similar to myself, mostly white people in Sonoma Valley. Well, what do we do? And she said, well, use your privilege as a weapon. And so I thought, as far as this presentation, what I'm hoping to do is to use, I have the privilege of giving this presentation. And thank you to Ingrid and thank you to the Land Trust for this opportunity. And there are other people I know that have much more of a personal experience with some of these attitudes and situations than I do, and in many ways are probably better people to tell the story. But at least for the moment, I have the storyteller's hat on, so I'm going to do the best I can. Like I said, I kind of feel a little bit blind. So this presentation is an attempt to open my eyes a little bit and hopefully open your eyes as well. Like I mentioned, I think what happened to me with that realization about Glen Ellen is similar to what happened to the entire country when George Floyd was killed, and everybody woke up to the reality of police brutality, even though it's been going on, pretty much forever. Somehow that was a real wake up for people. And I recently read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, who, as you probably know, was born a slave and managed to escape to the North and became a very famous orator and writer. And so I read his autobiography, and it was really quite stunning to hear about his experiences growing up as a slave in the 1830s, 1840s, and things that were reminding me of what's going on today. Just some of the attitudes, not treating Black people like full people. He describes his brother being thrown to the ground and having his head stomped on by his overseer and fracturing his skull, which was very reminiscent of what happened to George Floyd. So it feels to me like this, what I'm talking about really isn't history in a lot of ways. It's things that have just continued on, and they're not going to change until we are able to take a good look at them. So that's where I'm coming from today. And as far as, and I thought, well, how can I frame this this whole talk? And I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to focus on the Chinese, but I also am going to mention Native Californians, and blacks in California and early California. I'm not going to talk about Mexicans and Hispanics, just because this subject quickly gets very broad, but that would easily be worth another presentation. So I started thinking about how to frame this talk, and I kept coming back to the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence, which really is it's the founding document of the United States, of course. And the very first principle that's expressed by Thomas Jefferson is that all men are created equal. And that, of course, that definition has been broadened over the years, but just that basic idea that all people are created equal. Now, of course, Jefferson himself was a slave owner, so there's a contradiction right there in him saying that, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of the presentation. But I think if we take that as our frame for thinking about some of these things, we can see how this country has gone off track on that, and also tried to find our way back to that many times over the years. So, the Declaration 1776, Constitution was ratified in 1789, and the very next year, Congress passed the Naturalization Act, which restricted citizenship to free white persons of good moral character. And of course, that was, women, I guess, were citizens but couldn't vote, and that immediately divided everybody into at least two categories, and there were all sorts of implications for that are mentioned on the screen. And that act was in place for well over 150 years. So that's one thing I want to just frame this with, is that all people are created equal, but there was a contradiction at the very beginning of the country with that phrase. And then I also want to bring in this idea that I just heard about recently. I heard Isabel Wilkerson on the radio talking about her latest book, Caste. And she's a Pulitzer Prize winner, by the way. And her idea is that racism is it's a worthy thing to think about, but really caste is a much more kind of revealing idea to look at this country. And so, of course, caste exists in lots of different cultures. I've traveled in India, where the caste system is pretty strong. There, if you see somebody working with leather, they're probably a lower caste, because upper caste people don't work with leather. It's considered unclean. Lots of things like that. So that would be a signal in India. If you see somebody working with leather, that's a signal that they're a lower caste. And then, as Wilkerson says, here in the U.S., the signal is race. And so the caste is the bones and race is the skin. And if you think about it, she's got a quote there about the difference between class and caste, which I'll let you read on your own. But caste is something you can't really change. And caste, some of the aspects of caste are that it establishes a social hierarchy, it segregates groups, it limits occupations, and it also makes restrictions on marriage. Those are just a few of the aspects of caste. And she and other sociologists say that, really looking at the United States, that caste is a much better concept to think about it than just pure race. So I'm going to start with Native Californians, and many societies have caste, and I don't know Native Californian culture well enough to say whether they had caste or not. I do know there were different social strata, so at some level there was a hierarchy. But where I really want to start is the beginnings of European contact in California, and which started in the 18th century. And interestingly, the very same year that the Declaration of Independence was signed, the San Francisco Mission was founded, just a few years after the very first mission down in San Diego. And that immediately created a social hierarchy. You had the priests and the soldiers, and the Spanish were the upper part of the social structure, and then the native people were the lower part. And the original idea for the mission system was to train native people, to convert them to Christianity, and then train them in farming and other trades so they could basically be good European style citizens and subjects to the king back in Spain. That didn't quite happen. They were originally imagining it would take 10 years and never really happened. The mission in Sonoma was founded almost 50 years after the San Francisco mission, and was here for 10 years, and then finally it was secularized. So the natives at the missions, there's a great book called Time of Little Choice, and it covers the native experience during the mission era, and really lays it out as that they're really, there's sometimes people say, well, there's somewhat of a choice involved in joining a mission, but considering what was going on, there was very little choice involved. And once somebody entered the mission, they usually couldn't leave. And one of the things to think about these groups is all the contributions that they made to California and national history that are usually often forgotten. I mean, the natives built the missions. They were the laborers for the missions. And that was true in Sonoma as well. So after the Sonoma mission had been here for 10 years, General Vallejo arrived. The missions were disbanded. Vallejo got to pass out the best land to his family and his friends. And then, he had all those, the people who'd been at the mission then became his workers. And, we put Vallejo up on this pedestal. Here's his latest pedestal, a bench in the Sonoma Plaza. But he had this huge ranch house over the Petaluma Adobe, which is now a state park. The barracks in Sonoma are a state park. Vallejo is really revered around here. And, there have been a lot of statues that have been torn down lately. And I think it's important to really re-examine who we've made statues of, and if that person, they may be deserving of being remembered, but maybe they're not deserving of being honored. And I haven't come to a full decision on Vallejo myself at this point, but just something to think about. And so that's the good side of Vallejo is, he welcomed the Americans, and he was a very industrious guy and had this huge land holding, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the other side of it, a little bit of the other side. The quote at the top is by a Pomo man who lives here in Sonoma Valley. So, his ancestors being fed out of horse troughs, that's not how you treat somebody who is created equally. And then during the pandemic of the late 1830s, which is really interesting to look at now in light of what's going on today. The Spanish or the Mexicans at that time, they had vaccinated people before this fairly successfully in the late 1820s, but for some reason Vallejo didn't do that. And it's the same situation we're seeing today, where people at the lower ranks of society are suffering much more from the pandemic, and the upper levels are not suffering as much. So that was happening even in 1837 here, on the frontier in Mexican California. And then, you can see these things. He just killed people for harvesting cattle because they had to feed themselves. All sorts of things: murder, rape, and abduction carried out, if not by him, then by his right-hand man, his brother Salvador. So there's a lot of things to reconsider about Vallejo. And he really had kind of a plantation mentality, if you want to think of it that way, of really a two-tiered system with slaves and overseers in many ways. So then we get into the 1840s, and things begin to change very quickly. Lots of Americans coming in, the Bear Flag Rebellion. Look at how close these dates are. June 1846, the Bear Flag Rebellion. Less than 2 years later, gold's discovered in the Sierra. The war ends between the U.S. and Mexico just like 8 or 9 days after gold is discovered. So California becomes officially part of the U.S. And then the following year, the gold rush. So all that within like 3 years. I mean, astounding amount of change. Okay, just trying to change this. Okay. Before we move on here, I want to just sort of end a little bit on Native people. And there's, you know, any one of these subjects we could easily spend hours on. But I do want to mention, so here's another bear flagger. This is Granville Swift. He's somebody else who, at least in the past, has been revered for being a bear flagger. There's a plaque up in Colusa County where his house used to be. And it says, you know, this was the first house of Granville Swift. It was built by his native laborers, his fields overseen by his native field hands, and his cattle were tended by native herdsmen. Well, you know, those people were his slaves. If you just substitute the word slave there, and he was from Kentucky, which was a slave state at that time, and Temmelek Hall, which is still there in the middle of the Temmelek development, built in the early 1850s, is a striking pre-Civil War era mansion. And there's a lot of stories about him treating his native servants as slaves, and mistreating them, I should say, and chaining them to the walls of his basement, and just not a good guy, but somebody, again, who has been revered in the past. And something else that happened with Native people is that after California became a state, law was passed, so people were being paid a bounty on scalps from natives. And there also was a law passed that if a native child did not have any parents, then you could, quote unquote, adopt them and basically make them your servant. And so what happened is, mobs went into native villages, killed all the adults, and took the kids, and began sometimes selling them into slavery, using them as household servants. So, very sad chapter. Now, here's somebody who I just learned about, who was at the Bear Flag Rebellion, James Grider, if I'm saying his name right. So he was a black man. He may have been the last survivor of the Bear Flag Rebellion. He died in 1924. He was in his 90s. And so the guys who pulled off the Bear Flag, a lot of them were Southerners or Southern sympathizers. A number of them owned slaves, and which is how he ended up being there. But one way or another, he managed to mine gold and buy his freedom. And he ended up living in Vallejo for the rest of his life, and was a very well-known horseman, and had a livery stable, and was a pretty respected member of the community, but largely forgotten, which is a sad thing. But I think one of the points about him to come to is that we are talking about the abuses that a lot of these groups suffered and the discrimination, but there were people among these groups who managed one way or another to deal with the situation and come out as a success. And he was one of those people who managed to buck the system. So 1850s, Charles Stuart, who settled Glen Oaks later on. So he was from Pennsylvania. When he got married to Ellen, he ended up living up in upstate New York, was a merchant up there. He also, upstate New York at that time was really a very liberal part of the country. So it was the site of the first women's convention in 1848. A lot of abolitionists in the state of New York. It's a very, very liberal part of the country. And he brought that attitude with him, I think, when he came out. So California comes in as a free state in 1850, but it was a contentious admission, and there was a lot of how would you say it? it wasn't purely a free state. So for example, you know, if you were a colored person, as they used to say, you couldn't testify in court against any white person, and of course you could not vote. A few years later, the legislature passed a law that said that if you had been brought here as a slave, your owner could claim you as a slave, continue to claim you as a slave. And there was a case of 3 miners who had been given their freedom, ran a very successful business up in the Sierra for several years. And then their previous owner in Mississippi, contacted somebody who got the sheriff, rounded them up, and they ended up being deported back to Mississippi to be enslaved again. On the other hand, Biddy Mason is another example of somebody who came here, was successful. Somehow she got into court and managed to win her freedom. I think maybe because she got here after statehood. So she didn't fall under that 1852 law. And then the woman on the left, that's Mary Ellen Pleasant, who owned Beltane Ranch just up the road from Glen Oaks. An amazing woman, was involved with the Underground Railroad, and John Brown came out to California in 1854 to get away from the Fugitive Slave Act because she was afraid somebody was going to grab her and put her back into slavery. Became a very successful businesswoman out here in California, and really fought for her race her whole life. She, as I said, she started the Underground Railroad in California. She fought for the right of blacks to ride streetcars in San Francisco in the 1860s, won the right for blacks to testify in court. And when she was buried in Napa in the early 1900s, her gravestone says, "Friend of John Brown." So she was another black person who managed to make a success of herself despite all the obstacles that she faced. So now we're up to the arrival of the Chinese. There were very few Chinese in the United States before the gold rush, but the gold rush brought them in. And the American miners quickly became very jealous. And so the legislators passed a foreign miners tax, and $20 a month at that time, that was about a month's wages every month if a Chinese miner wanted to stay here. And of course, it was only enforced for the Chinese. It wasn't enforced. If you were a Swedish miner, it was unlikely they were going to charge you the foreign miners tax. It was amended a few times, so it did change, but that basically was what happened. And then a few years later, the Transcontinental Railroad was underway as the Civil War was coming to a close. And so the Central Pacific Railroad realized that the Chinese were this huge labor force that they could use to complete the railroad. And they turned out to be, for the most part, better workers than the other people they had been hiring. They'd work longer hours for less pay. And they didn't have what was called, they didn't come down with what was called bottle flu, which is basically a hangover. The white workers would drink and not be very good the next day, and the Chinese were not big drinkers. So the workers who worked on the western part of the railroad, there's 2 lines, one coming from the east, one coming from the west, and they met in Utah in 1869. And the Chinese worked on the western part of the railroad, and 90% of those workers on the western side were Chinese. So just, it was mostly their efforts that brought the Transcontinental Railroad to fruition at that time. So here's the celebration in Utah. And if you look through the crowd, I have a hard time identifying anybody who I could say for sure is Chinese. There's a couple faces that maybe, but otherwise, and those are very questionable, I'd say. The people who are there at the party, the people who are invited to the party are all the white guys. And the Transcontinental Railroad really was an amazing thing for the entire country. Instead of spending several months getting from the East Coast to the West Coast by sea or overland in a wagon train, you could now travel from New York to San Francisco in less than a week. So it really tied the whole country together. And the Chinese, that was a huge contribution that the Chinese made. And once the railroad was done, they started working in agriculture and other industries. And in Sonoma Valley, they became very valuable in the wine industry, which was really starting to grow by the 1870s. Buena Vista, which is one of the first commercial wineries in California, used a lot of Chinese labor. They said that there used to be Chinese huts up on the hill opposite the winery entrance. If you go inside their caves, you can see scratch marks where the Chinese were using their picks to dig out the caves. And interestingly, that's something they were doing on the railroad. They dug the tunnels through the mountains for the railroad, and then they came to Sonoma and dug the tunnels for the wine caves. So another contribution of the Chinese. And they were trustworthy. They were considered extremely trustworthy people. And skilled as well. Here's a little quote about a resident of Glen Ellen who worked at the Chauvet Winery and Distillery in Glen Ellen. And he was valued for the skills that he had. So 1870, Charles Stuart, he's in San Francisco. He's a merchant. He ends up buying land up here in Sonoma Valley in what would become Glen Ellen, and plants a vineyard in 1863, very likely with the help of Chinese laborers. Starts building his house, which is still there today, the house at Glen Oaks. And as best we know, it was built by Chinese masons. That's what's been told over many years, and I believe it. On the left or the right-hand side of this picture, you can see a building in the distance, which is also stone. Sadly, that was destroyed during the 2017 fires, but that's often called the Stone Barn, which is not a bad name for it, but I'm convinced that it may have originally served largely as a wine cellar. There's a lot of stone wine cellars like that were built during that era, and that was also built by the Chinese. So Charles Stuart really benefited from the skills and the industriousness and the trustworthiness of the Chinese. If you look at the 1870 census, you can see Charles up there on the, let's see, I don't know if this works for you guys, if you can see my cursor, and let me know afterwards, Ingrid, if this works. So there's Charles Stuart, wine grower. There's Ellen, who of course the town of Glen Ellen was named after. Here's their kids and grandkid. And then down here at the bottom are their household servants. By this time they were paid. These were not slaves. These were paid servants. And I may be saying this completely wrong, but Ah Tong and Ah Kwai were their two household servants. And I think during harvest time, Chinese workers came in and helped out in the harvest, and other ranches nearby had a lot of Chinese workers, and they may have traded them around. And then if you look at the census, this is the a kind of a look at diversity in Sonoma County in 1870. And admittedly, a lot of these groups were probably not fully counted. So the best we can say is that this is at least a kind of a comparative look at these different groups. But far more Chinese than blacks or native people. But notice, here's an interesting thing. There are a lot more blacks in Petaluma than anywhere else. And that's likely because Petaluma was a Union stronghold. Sonoma County was very much a southern-leaning county. After the Civil War, a lot of former Confederate soldiers came to live here, and it was not a friendly place for blacks in much of the county. And also quite a few Chinese in Petaluma. The most Chinese, though, are in Sonoma. So they were here mostly working as household servants and also as agricultural laborers. And then these native people out at Salt Point, these likely were Kashaya folks who were out there. So just kind of an interesting look at diversity at that time. So a very small proportion of the US population in 1870. A lot of these were in California. But there was this growing anti-Chinese sentiment, and so they were barred from obtaining citizenship, and they couldn't bring their wives over. A lot of the people, most of the people who came here were men in their 20s and 30s. Maybe a third of them had wives back in China, but they could not bring their wives here. So they were being encouraged not to stay, as one way to think of it. Just a few other things happening during that time. The Glen Ellen post office was established, and of course, Stewart named his ranch Glen Ellen after his wife. And then once it became the town of Glen Ellen, he called his ranch Glen Oaks. Phylloxera was starting to appear, which is going to be a problem later on, which ended up, it eventually destroyed his vineyard as well as many others in the area. And there was this increasing anti-Chinese sentiment in California. And what really made it worse was that there was a depression going on, lots of unemployed people, and the Chinese, as I mentioned before, were willing to work for longer hours for less pay than the white workers. And so it ended up that the Working Men's Party was formed. And this is kind of interesting. Charles O'Donnell, it was a little bit later, but he also was a resident of Glen Ellen. There's an O'Donnell Lane here in Glen Ellen, which kind of thinking it would be cool if we could rename it something a little better. But he was a very racist politician. I mean, this was their slogan: "The Chinese must go," and he was the regular anti-Chinese O'Donnell ticket. Kind of stunning in a way, and then when you think about current events, maybe not so stunning. But sometimes they got very unruly. They did have some good ideas, like trying to limit the amount of land somebody could hold so that more farmers could get land. But they really, their central issue was the Chinese and trying to get the Chinese out of California. And they were getting violent, and Charles Stuart, who of course was a merchant in San Francisco, he talks about being daily threatened by fear of the torch, which basically, I see the current news in that, of looting and arson going on. So this was a real scary thing at that time. And so one thing the Working Men's Party did was they really pushed for another California Constitutional Convention, which they managed to pull off in 1878. And there were some good reasons for this. The original Constitution for the state had been written kind of in a hurry in 1849, as the state was about to gain, or as California was about to gain statehood. And so it wasn't a particularly well-written document. And so there was a good case to be made that it should be redone. And I'm not a scholar on that Constitution, or so I won't go into the details. But there were a number of other issues that were being dealt with. But again, the Chinese must go was that was the slogan of the Working Man's Party, who really pushed to have that convention. And then once they got onto the floor of the convention, there was just lots and lots of anti-Chinese talk. But what's interesting, that quote at the top there, which was from a Chinese worker of the time, is saying how the Chinese, they were persecuted because of their good qualities, not because of their bad qualities. And then, someone else who was anti-Chinese at the bottom, talking about how, white men can't compete with the Chinese. If we did, we'd have to get up earlier in the morning, and we wouldn't be able to eat as well. And we'd have to surrender all that makes life worth living. So interesting perspectives. So these were some of the proposals for inclusion in the Constitution. And I won't go through all these, but you couldn't. They talked about not letting Chinese own real estate or fishing in California waters. confiscating the property of a business that hired California labor. One of the sort of strangest and maybe most egregious ones is they wanted to forbid the repatriation of corpses to China, because a lot of Chinese felt that when they died, that their body should go back to China, go back to their native land. And so all these ideas were thought of as ways to just make things so uncomfortable for the Chinese that they would want to leave. And so now we come to Charles Stuart's part of the convention. He was not part of the Working Man's Party. He was called a nonpartisan. And I'm going to turn on the light here, and hopefully you guys can still see me. I think so. There we go. So Charles Stuart didn't say a whole lot during the convention, but he did get up a couple times to speak and to really kind of call people to task for what they were suggesting. And so here's Charles Stuart's an excerpt from his speech. These men, after being invited to our shores, building our railroads, clearing our farms, reclaiming over 1 million acres of our swamp and overflowed land, planting our vineyards and our orchards, reaping the crops of the needy farmers, gathering fruits and berries, digging and sacking our potatoes, supplying our markets with fish from the sea, manufacturing our woolen and other goods, cleaning up the tailings of our mines, scraping the bedrock of our exhausted mining claims, and relieving most of the householders in this state of the household drudgery which would be imposed upon our wives and daughters, thus contributing to our happiness and true prosperity. Sir, after all this, which has added many millions annually to the state and nation's wealth, you would commit treason against our government by putting this unjust and inhumane article in our organic law. I beg of gentlemen on this floor to pause, to consider well, and not be carried away through blind prejudice, through political ambition, or through race hatred, but act like civilized, just, and Christian men, not to do an act that would shock all humane men throughout the world, both Christian and pagan. Sir, this is what I plead for and will ever plead for, and will sympathize with the weak and downtrodden of the world, and hope to ever remain on the side of humanity and justice as long as life shall last. So that was the speech that he gave. He received derisive laughter for it. He was one of only a few people to vote against these proposals. Interestingly, in the end, most of those proposals were not put into the Constitution because it was understood that either the California Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court would strike them out. So most of them did not end up in the California Constitution, but what they did is they then started encouraging the legislature to take up and make laws that basically would do the same thing. And on the same day that the Constitution was ratified, Stewart and Rutherford B. Hayes, the President of the United States, who refused to sign a National Chinese Exclusion Act, they both were burned in effigy in the Sonoma Plaza. So that was the consequence for Stewart. So when you think of the times, it was really an extremely brave thing for him to do. And when you think about him using his privilege as a weapon, I think he deserves a lot of credit for doing that. And so that's what came out of that. Unfortunately, he died just a little over a year later, in 1880. But all of those things that were going on at the convention, the anti-Chinese sentiment was, if anything, getting worse. Ellen was left at the ranch to manage the ranch by herself. Well, herself and their son, Charles Duff Stewart. And she's a whole nother story, but she became a success as a woman who could not vote, and at least in the beginning was not really allowed to run her own business. She became a very successful winemaker, and petitioned the court to act in her own behalf and be able to sign contracts. And so she's another piece of the civil rights story of Glen Oaks that I'm not going to cover tonight, but there's a lot there, you know, a lot to consider when you think about Glen Oaks and that part of the story. So, so just a few years later, the federal government did pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, as that cartoon says, forbid Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 20 years and forbid Chinese from becoming citizens again. Somehow they felt like they kept needing to repeat that. I'm not sure why. And so this part, I apologize, I don't have too many graphics. I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly. I think I'm getting a little close on time here. I'm not going to read through all this, but I'll pull out some of the most interesting parts of this. So in 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that laws that were enforcing racial discrimination violated the 14th Amendment, which of course was passed after the Civil War. But then just 3 years later, they upheld the Chinese exclusion law's constitutionality. I'm not sure how that is, except that maybe it was a difference between citizens and foreign nationals. And then the Geary Act extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years in 1892. And Geary, by the way, came from Santa Rosa. So, you know, plenty of local folks besides O'Donnell in this whole mix here. And then this also, the late 1890s was also when this idea of the yellow peril became very popular, if you want to call it that. And this idea that somehow the hordes from China and other parts of the East are going to overrun the United States, and basically that we would lose civilization was the idea. And eugenics comes in about this time. There's, again, a lot more to unpack there. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but but then things began to shift just a little bit. 1898, the Supreme Court ruled that if you were a US-born Chinese, you couldn't be divested of citizenship. So at least those folks were okay. But then Congress again made the Chinese Exclusion Act indefinite. And they were arresting Chinese immigrants without search warrants. They forbid intermarriage between whites and Mongolians. Mongolian, of course, is another word for Chinese. So this goes back to that whole caste idea, that the limitations and restrictions on marriage. One of the bright spots here was that after the San Francisco fire and earthquake, all the immigration records were lost. And so Chinese could petition to say, no, I was here legally. The records have been lost. And so some of them gained their citizenship that way. And then another exclusion act in 1924, which also created the Border Patrol, particularly to regulate Chinese immigration across the US-Mexico border. That's an interesting take on that. I had never seen that before. And then again, Chinese wives of American citizens are denied entry. So presumably even a white person who married a Chinese woman in China could not bring her back to the United States. But then, you know, during World War II, things started to change. The US became an ally with China against Japan. Finally, the Exclusion Acts were revoked by Congress, and eventually racial bias was removed from America's immigration laws, at least at some level, because we've certainly seen evidence of that recently. And then I just wanted to put these last few things here just to show a few more contributions by Chinese Americans, but then also the violence that continued. Even in 1982, Vincent Chin was killed, and they didn't receive, basically received a slap on the wrist, and not that long ago, really. And just 20 years ago, Chinese Americans reached 1% of the population, so becoming a little more of a significant group here. So let me see, let me check the time. I think I'm just about 7:54. Okay, I'm doing okay, I think. Just sort of two things to wrap up the Sonoma story, and then I'll pull back and give the bigger picture again. So recently, there has been more recognition in Sonoma of the essential part that Chinese laborers played, particularly in the wine industry and the early history of Sonoma Valley. And so I confess I haven't checked up on where this project is at, but there has been an effort to build a memorial to the Chinese in Sonoma, and contributions have been collected, and our sister city in China is also contributing to the building of this. So, so there's an effort to acknowledge and remember the Chinese, which is great. I think that's a positive step. But I'm also, when I think about all this, I'm also kind of sad for what we don't have now, and that is we don't have a Chinese community here in the town of Sonoma, at least not a vibrant one like there was 120, 130 years ago. And just this little picture, I think, just gives you a sense of how it might enrich our lives today. Sonoma Plaza, 1860s, and you could hear the picking of Chinese banjos and musical kites, strung with rubber bands buzzing in the wind. I think that's just a tiny glimpse of the richness that the Chinese could be contributing to Sonoma right now. And I hope maybe things always change, so who knows what the future holds. And now at the very end here, I just want to come back to that idea of all people are created equal, paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence now, because the definition of men has broadened to include pretty much everybody. I mean, there are people who don't agree with that, but and of course, everybody is endowed with certain rights that can't be taken away. That's the basic idea in the founding document of the United States from the first day that this nation was created. And I haven't actually been to the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C., but I was really interested to learn a little bit about it. And it stands right in between the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial. So right in between those two, which seems like a very fitting place. And this big sort of rock that's been hewn in half behind the statue of Martin Luther King, it's the Stone of Hope, coming out of the Mountain of Despair, and it faces right toward the Jefferson Memorial. And one writer that I read said that one way to think about all this is that Martin Luther King, Jefferson was a slaveholder. He was not a perfect man, as none of us are, perfect person. But Martin Luther King was holding him to his word. If you're going to create a nation that promises that all people are created equal, then we're going to hold you to that. And I just found that a very positive and optimistic way to think about all this, is that we're going to, if we frame the thoughts around that very first principle, I think we'll be okay. So I think there's just one more screen. I kind of want to leave it on this one, but let me see. I think there's whoops. I think I have one screen with credits after this. Yeah. So I'll leave this up just for a minute, and then I'll go back to that last screen, just because I like that better than just a bunch of words on a screen here. But thank you to all these folks, and it's when you start trying to think about all the places that the information and the ideas came from, it's kind of mind-boggling. So this really is a partial list of all the people and organizations that I owe a debt of gratitude to. And now I'm going to go back, and then I'm going to, let's see, unless I have to stop sharing, or maybe Ingrid, let's see, Ingrid, if you want to tell me what, I can look at my notes, or you can tell me what to do right now.
Hi, Arthur.
Hey, Ingrid.
So we have a number of questions that people have submitted. So
Okay.
at this time, I'll go ahead and ask you some of the questions.
Okay. And does our screen work? Is that or should I stop sharing and just go to my video?
Well, people can see you as well as the video. So
Okay. All right. That works. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So thank you so much for the very detailed and thorough presentation and walkthrough time. I know and I'm sure many of us learned a lot through all of your research and documentation. So we had a number of questions, and let's see here. One person is asking what the name of the woman who founded the Underground Railroad in California was.
Mary Ellen Pleasant.
Great, thank you.
You can Google her. You'll find out a ton of information. She's a really interesting person, and yeah, she's got a great history. And somebody said that if she had been white and a man, she would have been president. And learning about her story, I did an article in the PD recently about her. There's a place called Mary Ellen's Cave up in the Miacamas. So if you Google Mary Ellen's Cave in the Press Democrat, you could find that as well.
Great, thank you. And then someone asked about if you could talk about the Chinese in Sonoma and owning businesses on the plaza.
Let's see, I read a little bit about that. I didn't take good notes, I apologize, but there were Chinese laundries around the Sonoma Plaza, and there were, there was definitely a Chinese community in Sonoma. If that person wants to give me their email, I'd be happy to, or just follow up with a general email to people. I could give you a little bit more information about that. I think, there was a community in Sonoma, and then there also were communities at various ranches. Buena Vista had a lot of Chinese living at the Buena Vista winery, in their own small homes and stuff, or huts, whatever they were. I'm not sure exactly what they looked like. But of course, many people in the lower class of society at that time lived in similar dwellings.
Okay, and then there is a question for the 1870 census. How were Mexicans and Californios counted?
I don't believe they were separated out. I would have to look. One of the interesting things when you start looking at race in this country is that it's actually it's a created thing. It's not there's no definitive line between a black person and a white person, or people have tried to create that, but it doesn't really exist. So I think the Hispanic folks were counted as white people. That's something else I can follow up and look at the census, but the pages of the census that I've looked at, they do list, they list white and colored, but I don't believe the Hispanics were considered colored, although the Chinese were considered colored for whatever reason. So, but I see what I can figure out there.
Okay, and then we had a comment. Someone said that Mexican origin people, including Californios, people from Mexico and other Latin Americans, mostly Chileans, also had the foreign miners tax used against them.
Okay, good. I've studied this stuff, but I'm not what I would call an expert on this. So thank you for, yeah.
And then there's a question that asks, were majority white Californians particularly threatened by Chinese more than in other states? And of the anti-Chinese sentiment grew to all the state, was Sonoma and San Francisco area acutely more fearful of the Chinese workers?
I think that's probably true. My impression is that the numbers of Chinese in Sonoma and San Francisco and in California were, we had I would need to look at the census, but I would guess we had the highest proportion of Chinese in the U.S. But I think it must have obviously, if the U.S. government, U.S. Congress passed a law about it, they must have been concerned for the whole country. There was this idea that the Chinese hordes were going to come in, and so maybe that was sort of the thinking. It was like, well, we got to stop this now because otherwise they're going to take over. So my impression is that California was really the forefront of it because there was work here, and there was, it was pretty easy to access in the early days. It took about the same amount of time to get to California from China as it did to go from the East Coast to California. So it was really, in a real sense, it was pretty equidistant.
Okay, and then another question is, when did they stop using Chinese labor at Glen Oaks Ranch? And was it replaced by another group? And why did the Chinese leave the area ultimately?
Good questions, and tough to answer, and somebody else probably knows this better than I do. So my impression is, there's several questions in there, but my impression is that all the anti-Chinese laws and sentiment slowly pushed people out. I can send this by email too. There's some memories that were collected by the Sonoma Valley Historical Society back in the 1930s. A man named George Breitenbach remembered the Chinese in Sonoma, and he talked about how there were less and less of them. For a little while there were a lot. He remembered a lot, and then there were less and less. And not many of them stayed, probably just because it was an unfriendly environment. I don't know what happened to Glen Oaks exactly. Charles died in 1880, and then not too long afterwards, phylloxera came to Glen Oaks, and so by the mid 1890s or even early 1890s, the grapes were pretty much decimated. So there may not have been as much of a need for certain types of labor at that point. And the grapes were not replanted for quite a while. In fact, I think not till maybe even after the land trust got it. I think it was part of the deal with the transfer, but don't quote me on that one. So let's see. So I think it was just kind of this unfriendly attitude that, unfriendly is putting it too lightly, but this very, racist attitude and lots of laws that just encourage Chinese people to go somewhere else. Some of them may have gone to other parts of the Americas. Some of them probably went back to China. Did I get it all? Or,
Yeah, I think that was good. And then how do we know or believe that the stone masonry on the house was done by the Chinese?
I can't tell you. I don't have a definitive source for that. It's part of the story of Glen Oaks Ranch. So that's the best I can do. I haven't uncovered any labor contracts or anything like that. But I believe there are some other stone buildings in the area that were built by Chinese. We'd have to look into that a little more deeply, but it would be interesting to know where those are. There's also, there's some of the stone walls that we see, they were either built by Chinese. I think a lot of them were built by Chinese. And some of them were built by native people when they were slaves. So that's kind of part of the story too. As far as tracing who built a particular wall, I think that's, nobody probably kept a record of who was building a particular wall. So that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a question, how do we know about Charles Stuart's role in defending the Chinese at the California Constitutional Convention?
Well, that is well documented, happy to say. So they kept good notes, they kept good minutes, they had a good secretary. They even, there's even places where it talks about, there was laughter, something he said that people just scoffed at, they laughed derisively or whatever. So and you can get that, let's see. Well, there's I can send this by email too. I'll do that. It's an article by a man named Sandifor, who talks about the convention, and he pulls up all those documents and he puts it all together. And the piece that I read was in the record from the convention, so it was all recorded. So that's something that is well recorded, which is always nice to find as a historian.
And then in your research, have you met any descendants of the Chinese immigrants who labored in Sonoma?
I haven't, although Jim Shear, who might be, if he's on here, we could bring him in for a minute. He mentioned, because he did a presentation on the Charles Stuart back, I think about 6 years ago at Glen Oaks. He's another local historian and part of the Glen Ellen Historical Society. And he wrote about meeting an elderly Chinese woman who was looking for stone buildings that her grandfather had helped put up. So, you know, that's presumably he was around in the late 19th century. I mean, it's going pretty far back, but that's the only case I've heard of a you know, direct connection to some of these folks. I mean, there was a Chinatown in Santa Rosa. I have not had a chance to really trace what happened there, but that's basically gone. You can also, I believe Gay LeBaron has written about some of this, so that's something else I could send along, or you could look online. She's got an archive online. You can read about that.
And then someone was asking if you have gone through the Index Tribune microfiche in the mid to late 1800s.
I have been through some of it, but it's very painstaking work, and but there's a great resource online that I don't think yet includes the Index Tribune, but it does include the Sonoma Democrat, which is the precursor of the Press Democrat. And so you can actually do a search on that, and that if you just Google the California digital newspaper collection, you can go into that. It's a huge archive of, I think, a couple million pages of newspapers, and you could just Google Chinese, or if you want to use a racist term, you'll probably find those as well. And you could, you know, I did some research in there for this. You know, I had a limited amount of time, so I put together, I added on to what I already knew, basically, but certainly more. You can always go deeper, and it would be interesting to look at some of the Index Tribune on that as well.
All right, so then kind of a little bit outside of Sonoma, someone's asking about the story of China Camp in Marin and where that fits into the line of history.
Well, I'm dredging up things that I read there a number of years ago when I visited China Camp. So, so I can't tell you definitively, but somehow they were allowed to fish at China Camp and set up, you know, that fishing community. I'm sure you could find more information online, but that's an interesting community, definitely. And I wish I had more encyclopedic memory sometimes, but and there were also rural communities. There's the which is now a state. I think it's a state historical. Well, it's definitely a state historical site, but the town of Locke, which is out in the Delta, was a rural Chinese town, and that's pretty interesting. And there might even still be a few descendants of the original people out there.
All right, and then we have a couple of suggested references and contacts by people. One person is talking about the Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library, and that the library system has subscriptions to old local newspapers. And then someone is also mentioning there is a Redwood Empire Chinese Association. And so just wondering if you've used any of those sources in preparing the presentation for this evening.
I did use the library. I'm very familiar with the library. I didn't get a chance to contact the Chinese organization. I did talk to somebody I know who's Japanese, who had some connections with that a Chinese American. But I confess there's a lot more that I could do, but that's as far as I got. Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. I would love to spend more time on it.
Okay, and then someone was mentioning the Chinatown, the Santa Rosa Chinatown was torn down during urban redevelopment, and that it was located near the present government buildings in First Street, Santa Rosa.
Uh-huh.
That was just another thing. And then we also had someone asking about, let's see, Jack London and his racist views. If you have any knowledge or insight of that.
I can't say I have any detailed. I'm not well read in Jack London, so but the people I know and respect have told me that. So I know that he. Yeah, I've heard that. I can't really speak to it specifically, but yeah, I've heard that.
Okay. Let's see. So then I think I've gotten through most of the questions so far. So if anyone has any more questions, you could go ahead and submit them now. We'll give folks another minute or two. And let's see. Yeah, I think I've pretty much gotten to everything. So with that, we will be following up with an email to all attendees. We'll send some links to both a recording of this presentation, as well as some information where you can find out more information, or where you can contact Arthur to follow up with any other questions. So thank you very much, Arthur, for the presentation and doing all the research and really giving us a lot of a broader look at the history of this area. I know that right now a lot of people are looking at how do we put our current present day events into a historic context. Where did this all start? Where did it come from? How did we find ourselves where we are? And I know I really appreciate you giving us a big overview of things that that we might not be thinking or realizing as we relate to our present day world. So then I wanted to let you all know that we do a webinar once every month. Next month, we will be doing it on September 24th, and it's going to be about birding as an antidote to anxiety and social isolation. So keep your eyes open when we announce that one. And it will again be on a Zoom webinar platform as part of our Language of the Land series. And then again, for those of you who are not already supporters of the Land Trust, we are a nonprofit organization. We are funded by donations. And if you feel inspired to give a donation, you can go to our website at sonomalandtrust.org and just click on the donate button. And we also will be sending a survey out if you would like to give us some more feedback on tonight's presentation. So with that, Arthur, if there's anything else you have to say.
Well, just thanks for the opportunity to present, and you know, I learned a lot from putting this together, and I appreciate all the input from other folks who are watching. And like I said, there's a lot that I don't know, and I always like to learn something from the participants. So thank you for chiming in, and I'll look forward to emailing folks who are interested.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time.